Now, ZBrush gives us the ability to sculpt and paint in layers, much like you would experience in Photoshop. The layering system is found here under the Tool menu under Layers. Now, it's very important that you not get confused with the Layer menu up here at the top of the screen. This was from ZBrush's 2.5D illustration toolset. This has nothing to do with sculpting. The Layer menu up here at the top of the screen is, for all intents and purposes, not really used anymore. You might find it useful if you were using the document window to create an alpha, but even those are antiquated techniques at this point. So it's best to just disregard this layer menu and only focus on the layers menu found under the tool menu. So here we've got our alien bust. Make sure that we're on the head subtool and make sure that we're at our highest subdivision level. Now we're going to go to the layers menu and create a new layer. Now you see it says untitled layer and it's in record mode. Now if I want to change the layer name, I'm going to change the name and I'm going to call it Scales. So anything that I sculpt in this layer is going to be adjustable by this opacity, and I can turn it on and off. So let's take a look at how we can do that. I'm going to go ahead, make sure that my X symmetry is turned on, and I'm going to mask out part of the head here. I'm going to put a scale pattern on the back and sides of the head. So it'll just be a different little bit of texture that's sculptural that's been added to this creature. Let's extend this mask down to the back and to the shoulders. Now I want to feather the edges of the mask. So what I'll do is I'll step down a couple subdivision levels and watch what happens to my layer. When I step down my subdivision levels, the layer controls disappear. Now I am still in this layer and anything that I add will be added to this layer, but you can only adjust the settings of your layer when you're on the subdivision level where you actually created the layer. That's important to remember because once you start adding layers, you have to be on that subdivision level to adjust them. That's why I always try and add layers when I'm sure that I'm at the highest subdivision level that I'm going to create. There we go. Now I can control click to feather this mask, and I'm going to control click on the background to invert it. Now I'm going to step back up to my highest subdivision level. I only step down so I could feather the edges of that mask more effectively. I'll now go to the Surface menu. So we'll go to Surface, turn on Noise, and that'll bring up the Noise Maker plugin. We'll turn on Edit, there we go, and we'll rotate around to the back and zoom in. If you want to learn more about Noise Maker, there's an entire video chapter just on Noise Maker that I encourage you to watch. I'm going to open up Noise Plug, and this opens up a whole separate section of this menu. Noise Plug is the Noise Maker. I'm going to turn on Veroni, and then click OK. I'm going to take Mix Basic Noise and turn that down to 0, and I'm going to turn my strength up so I can see what I'm going to get here. There you can see we've got this really cool kind of scale pattern. I'm going to adjust my plugin scale. Let's turn it down a little bit like that. And because I feathered the edges of the mask, the effect is going to be weaker along the edges there. So let's go ahead and click OK. Now you can see it's applied that texture. I'm going to come down here and click Apply to Mesh because this right now is just a procedural projection. This is not part of the geometry. But if I click Apply to Mesh, that will bake that down into my mesh. Now if I clear the mask, you can see that we've got that nice scale texture there. Now if we go back to our Layer menu, it's still in record mode. I'm going to click next to record, and that is the eyeball. That just shows me that it's set to visibility instead of record. If I try and sculpt now, it's going to tell me that the mesh has deformation layers, that I have to be in a recording layer to actually sculpt or paint. That's another important thing to keep in mind with layers. Once you create a layer, you have to be in a recording layer to change your model. So now I can adjust the intensity. If I turn this down, you see it changes the opacity of that layer. I can even go into the negative range and invert that so it's pressing in instead of out. We'll bring that back up to 100%. Now down here I've got some other options. I can create a new layer here. We've already renamed the layer. I have the option to duplicate the layer. So if I duplicate this layer, it'll effectively double it up. Here I have the option to delete a layer. Here I can merge down. So if I click merge down, it'll merge those two layers down into one. So I've effectively doubled the effect of that layer by duplicating it and merging it. And I can invert the layer, and that will just invert the layer effect. Now I can bake them all. If I've got multiple layers and I just want to get rid of them, I can bake them down, and that will remove them. It'll bake down the effects and get rid of all of my layers. But let's create a new layer now, and instead of doing sculpting on this layer, we'll do painting on this layer. Let's do some kind of a spot pattern up here at the top of the head. I'll go to my standard brush, turn on RGB, and let's select maybe a purple color here. And I'm just going to paint some kind of a pattern on here. This will be bilaterally symmetrical, so it's kind of like the type of skin patterning you might see in the natural world. I'll go to the drag rectangle stroke, and I'll go to this irregular alpha here, let's say alpha 8. Let's turn our draw size up, and let's turn the focal shift way down so we just get a hard edge on that patterning, and we'll just do some little patterns here, like this. Now this poly paint lives in this layer. So let's do a little bit more, just breaking up the edges here. And one more there. Now if I click next to record, I'm back in visibility mode. If I step down my subdivision levels, I no longer have access to changing this layer. Step back up, go back into record mode. There we go. If I step back down, I no longer have access to change the layer. That's while I'm in record mode. If I step back up to my layer or to my subdivision level where I created that layer, now I have the ability to change it or change its visibility. Go to visibility. Now I can dial back the opacity on this, turn it back up. Perhaps I want to go to the Polypaint menu, and I'm going to use the Adjust Colors plugin. Now, if you have not seen the video yet, there's an entire video just on Adjust Colors. Now, because I'm in a layer, this is only going to impact what's actually in this layer. Oops, let's expand that out again. Also, we need to make sure that we are in record mode. Otherwise, any changes we make are not going to update. So let's go back to Polypaint. Let's go to Adjust Colors, and let's select purple. Let's go ahead and blur the mask, and let's adjust our tolerance a little bit. Let's turn that down. Get that real close to the edge there. Okay, now I'm going to adjust my hue. Click OK. And there you see that that adjusts just that poly paint that was in that layer. If I clear my mask, you see the effect that we get. I can go back to Adjust Poly Paint. And let's go ahead and maybe select green this time. Let's turn our tolerance, or adjust our tolerance on here. Tell you what, let's just grab this and adjust our tolerance. There we go. Let's invert that mask. Blur it. And let's adjust our saturation here. I want to get that right up to the edge. There we go. Click OK, and there you see we can adjust that color based on our adjust colors controls, but it's not going to have an effect or be able to do anything to any of that poly paint that doesn't live inside of a layer. So let me go to my layers menu again, and if I adjust my layer opacity, I can turn that down into 0, removes it completely. I can turn it up a little bit, fade it out just slightly. I can duplicate this layer, thereby sort of changing the color intensity just by doubling it up. And then of course I can go in and do color adjustments on this. If I go into record, go to poly paint, adjust colors, and let's go ahead and do a color sample of that. Change our hue. Click OK. Now that color, if we go back to our layers, we can adjust independently of the red sitting beneath it. So we can sort of mix those two together if we'd like to. So if I go to masking, I have the ability now to mask by poly paint. So what I can do is I can come down here and go to mask by color, mask by poly paint, and it's a very, very similar effect here. I can select the color that I want to adjust. I can blur my mask. I can adjust my tolerance just so I get a little bit of an edge on that. Click OK. And now I've got a mask that's isolating just sort of the edges here. If I control click, I can invert that mask. I can go back to poly paint, adjust colors, and then I can pick up that mask and then I can make a major change to the poly paint here and click OK. Clear the mask, and now we get that nice kind of orange feathering around the edges of our poly paint. Go to my layers, and I'm going to select this layer here. I'm just going to go one layer up. I find it best to select layers with these arrows because if you click the layer, sometimes you accidentally change the opacity. I'll click merge down, and that merges those two poly paint layers down. And then I can adjust the opacity on those, but it still maintains that nice kind of orange feathered edge there. So poly paint and sculpting can both live in layers. Again, anything that I've got that's not in a layer, I'm not going to be able to change. I can't change that poly paint that's in the base that's not living in a layer. It's only those things that are sitting inside of a layer. Let's rename this, and we'll call it head pattern. Now we can also create a layer for large shape changes. You'll see this if you watch the video on blend shapes. We'll create blend shapes and facial expressions using layers. But I'm just going to take the move brush here, and let's say I just want to see what this might look like with an entirely different head shape. I can come in here and make these big changes at the lower subdivision levels. Maybe I want to change the width of the head and the shape of these antennae. Let's bring these out and give them a little bit of a curve maybe. Take the move brush, add a little bit more of a bulge to the head here. Take the magnify brush, and let's just really go to town on this cranium, make it huge. And maybe the ends of these antennas a little bit. Oops, let's undo that. Turn our brush size down, and there we go. We can get the ends of those antennas. And take the move brush and give those a little bit more of a curve. Step back up to our highest subdivision level, and that will return the layer controls. Click the eyeball next to it, and now I can dial this back and dial it back up. And that way, if perhaps it happens to me often, someone asks to see a wedge, what would this character look like with various increments of a different head size? I can do 10% increments of that head size and export images for an art director to look at and say, oh, okay, I like option number 5. Let's go with that one. So it's really nice to be able to have these types of big shape changes, these big sculptural changes represented in our mesh, as well as these finer details. Let's say they want to see it without the scales. I can turn the scales down to 0 or just turn off visibility on that layer, and I can show it with and without those details. So the layers menu is very, very powerful. The thing that you just need to keep in mind is once you start creating layers, you have to be in a layer with record mode on to make changes. The layer menu is also used for blend shapes, like I said, and it's also used with Subtool Master, which if you watch the video on posing in Subtool Master, you'll see that it is possible that we can store our character pose in a layer for each subtool, which can be very, very nice. If we want to return to a neutral position and make some changes, we can do that and then return to our pose as necessary. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next video. So let's take a look now at how we can use ZBrush layers to support us in creating facial blend shapes. We'll go ahead and take a look at that now. So now we've reset ZBrush and loaded in our character again. We're at our highest subdivision level and we have no layers. So we're going to create a new layer and we're going to call this layer Mouth Closed. With this layer in record mode, I'm going to step down subdivision levels. And let's just turn off our poly paint. We don't need color for this. And now at our lowest, well, not quite the lowest, I think we are at the lowest subdivision level. That's good. We want as few polygons as possible to have to deal with at this stage. I'm going to close the lips. So I'm just going to take the move brush and I'm just going to shift the lower lips up. Let's mask out the lower jaw. Take the upper lips and bring these down, and let's shift that nose down a little bit because he is snarling. It's raising the tissue in that area. Let's invert that mask and let's bring this up to meet. Oops, let's mask that upper lip a bit more. Control, click, and drag. Control, click, and drag. Get a marquee around that. Now we should be able to get that lip without affecting the upper lip. We'll turn off X-symmetry because we actually have an asymmetrical sculpt here in the mouth. Invert that mask and let's just bring that upper lip down. Control click to feather the mask, and we just want to bring those lips together. Clear the mask and let's just bring the corners of the mouth down a little bit so we're not quite smiling. Now we'll zoom in here and just take the inflate brush and just gently inflate those lips together, like so. Now I'll step back up my subdivision levels. And let's step down one or two more and just do a couple little tweaks to the shapes here. Again, we just want to bring the corners of the mouth down so that we don't have that little smirk. We'll make that a different shape. Make sure that our nostrils come down. Again, because the nose comes up with the nasolabial folds when he's snarling. There we go. Now let's step up to our highest subdivision level. Go to our layers menu and go into view mode. So now mouth closed at 100% is the mouth closed. And if we dial this back, we can bring those lips back apart. So let's create a new layer now. Create a new layer. And let's make this brow up. Again, I'll step down my subdivision levels, and I'm going to use the move brush, but I'm going to, when I touch the mesh, there we go. When I touch the mesh, I'm going to touch down with the move brush, then hold the shift key, and I can slide these faces up. So that's basically touch down with the move brush and then press the shift key, and that will slide faces along the surface of the mesh. Let's bring that up a bit, bring that up, and let's scooch those together a little bit. Now we'll step back up to our highest subdivision level, click the eyeball next to record, and we can go back and forth. Let's Control N. We accidentally snapshotted that to the canvas. There we go. We can slide that slider up and down and get some facial animation in the brow. So let's set this back to 0 just by hitting 0 manually. And let's create a new layer, and we'll call this Brow Furrow. There we go. And again, step down your subdivision levels. It's much, much, much easier to sculpt these facial shapes at a lower subdivision level because you're not dealing with millions of polygons. We're dealing with far fewer polygons. So let's bring this down. Let's compress the corrugator and the brow muscles here and make it feel like he's really crunching this together. Let's shift these faces over using that trick with the move brush and shift. Now we're going to invert that mask, and let's just bring this up a little bit, create a little buckle there at the bridge of the nose. And I'm going to take the inflate brush, turn down my Z intensity, and just do a little bit of inflating here so it feels like these are compressing a little bit. Step back up to our highest subdivision level. And now we can go to View and use the slider to adjust that brow furrow. So let's set that back to 0. And let's create a new layer. Let's call this Smile. We'll step down our subdivision levels. And we'll turn on X symmetry for this. And let's just bring the corners of that mouth up a little bit. So it's tugging those up, and then shift those back as we did using the Shift key. I'll take the inflate brush and just gently inflate. Let's turn off X symmetry for that because the nasolabial folds here are not symmetrical. Let's inflate the flesh along here so it feels like it's buckling up. Take the damn standard brush and we can just crease that in just a little bit. And now step back up our subdivision levels to the highest. Click the eyeball next to record, and then we can scrub that smile up and down. So let's set smile to 0. And let's set mouth closed to 0. And let's set brow furrow to 1. And let's create a new layer now. We'll rename this and call it neck. So here I want the platysma, the ropey muscles of the neck to really come out as if he's straining when he's creating that snarl. So I'll go to the Clay Tubes brush, change to alpha 1, and I'm just going to stroke along here, creating those tendons, really bunching those tendons up in the neck. Maybe go to the standard brush with alpha 1 as well. I just really want to punch these up a little bit. Let's step up a subdivision level, and let's really go to town with that. Just make those feel like they're really getting strained. And catch some shadow in there, holding down the Alt key. There we go. Put a little bit of smooth in between there and step back up to our highest level. Now you see we've got this nice straining platysma muscle here. Let's click the eyeball next to it, and then we can dial that back. So that'll really play nicely with the snarl. As the character snarls, we can bring that neck musculature in so it feels like he's really straining as that snarl comes into play. So we can set that back to 0. Now I'm going to go to the Movie menu, open up Timeline, and click Show. Now the timeline allows us to do animations inside of ZBrush. So I'm going to first off click 2 keyframes here for the camera. That's how you have to start every animation in ZBrush, is have 2 keyframes to the camera start and end. So let's scroll back to the beginning here, and let's set mouth closed to 1. And let's set brow up to 0. Brow furrow we shall set to 0. Smile is set to 0 and neck is set to 0, and let's set mouth closed. Yeah, let's leave mouth closed at 1. So now with mouth closed selected, I'm going to click a keyframe here. You see I've keyed the mouth closed layer. So if I scroll forward a little bit, let's key it again. Scroll forward a little bit more, and then we will set this to 0. And that's going to start opening that mouth. Let's set that manually to 0, and then we'll keyframe that here. So as I scroll through the timeline now, you'll see that animation is right there. Now let's go to Brow Furrow. We'll select Brow Furrow. Make sure we are at the first keyframe here. Keyframe it at 0. Now you can see the ghosts of my other keyframes. So here is the next 0 keyframe for mouth open. Let's keyframe that there. And then I'd like the brow to start furrowing, and I think I'd like it to be completely furrowed just before the mouth is totally open. So let's turn that up to 1. And then we'll add a keyframe just before the mouth finishes opening. So if we scrub through that now, you'll see the brow begins to move at the same time as the mouth, but it completes its range of motion just before the mouth is totally snarled. So let's come back down here now and let's go to neck. So we'll set neck to 0, keyframe it here, and again we see the ghosts of the other keyframes. Let's scroll to here, leaving it at 0. And then we'll go to the full range of the snarl, and let's set neck to 1, and keyframe that there. So now as we slide along the timeline there, we see the neck come into play as well. The muscles of the neck straining as that snarl comes into play. Now as he's snarling, it would be nice to see the lower lids move as well, because that's a key part of that facial expression. If you raise your cheeks and raise your nasolabial folds, your lower eyelids can't help but come into play. So let's create a new layer. We'll name this layer Lower Eyelids, Raise. We're in record mode. We're just going to step down our subdivision levels. And I'm going to mask out the lower lids, and we're going to leave X symmetry turned off on this because the eyelids, the eyes themselves, are asymmetrical in this sculpture. I'm going to take the move brush, and I just want to slide these lower lids up a little bit so we get a little bit of a, the eyes coming up and covering where the irises will be. It'll create more of a malicious kind of feeling. It'll add a little something to that snarl. Let's step back up our subdivision levels. Go into the eyeball view, and then as we scrub this, you'll see those eyelids come up. So let's set this to 0. Keyframe it at 0. Make sure it's visible. Turn visibility on. I'm going to get rid of that keyframe. Just click and drag off the timeline to get rid of the keyframe. There we go. Set this to 0 and keyframe that. Scroll forward. Keyframe it one more time, and then let's get to the full extent of the snarl, and let's bring this all the way up to 1 and keyframe it there. So now as we scroll through this, you'll see those eyelids come into play as well, creating a much more realistic kind of facial expression. So if I want to save this work, including my timeline, what I need to do is go to File, Save As. I'm going to save a project file. Now a Z tool will save all of my layers, but the project file will save my timeline as well. So I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to go to File, Save As, and save a project file. Now, how do we get our blend shapes out of Zbrush? Well, there's two ways to do that. The first way is we can actually render a movie of our animation in action. I can do that by going to the movie palette, and I'm going to set it to large, which gives me the full resolution of my document. So if I go to document, that will be the resolution of my video. I can set that to HD resolution if I want HD, or smaller if I just need a test file. Now going back to the movie menu, I have the option to do the window, which is the full window including the interface, which is really not useful. Doc gives us just the document, just this image here. So now what I will do is I will press Control, Shift. Oh, one more thing. Before we do that, let's go to Movie. And down here we have Overlay Image. Turn your overlay image opacity down to 0. If you have a logo or watermark you want to put on your video, you can add that here. Go to Title Image and turn Fade In and Fade Out down to 0. So that will basically get rid of any sort of fade in image, which you could add here if you wanted to, and then give us just the animation that we're about to render. So to render that, Control, Shift, click under the timeline, and it will start to go through each frame There we go. Control Shift click. You can see it's recording the frames now. That is Control Shift click under the timeline. Now it'll go through my keyframes here, and once I get past this last keyframe, I can actually escape out of the recording. There we go. We've reached the full extent of the animation. So we can just go ahead and escape out. Just hit the escape key. Now if we go back to the movie menu, you'll see that we have the option to play our movie. So if I click play, here you can see we have an animation. Now if I want to export that animation, I'll turn on high quality and then click export. And then I can export this as an MPG. So I'll save that out, just like so. And it'll play through that animation. Now let's say I want to add some more keyframes now. So I've got this nice snarl here. So what I'll do is I'll scroll ahead a little bit and I will go ahead and key each one of these layers. So we'll go to eyes, let's select up. The arrows are very handy if you want to select a layer without accidentally changing its value. Go up, go up, go up, and go up. So now I've keyframed all those layers at the same point a few seconds later. Now let's bring it back down to neutral. So I'm going to come down to here. Let's set mouth closed to 1. And let's keyframe that down here. Let's step down and take brow up. And let's go ahead and raise the brow. Maybe he feels a little bad for being angry. We'll keyframe that there. Go to brow furrow, set brow furrow to 0. Keyframe that a little bit earlier, about there. Let's go to neck, set that to 0. Keyframe that. And let's go to lower eyelids and let's set that to 0 and keyframe that as well. So if we scrub through this, you'll see the animation. He snarls and then has second thoughts, closes his mouth, raises his eyebrows a little bit, and seems a little bit sad. So we want to render a new version of our film. So what we need to do is go back to the movie menu and click delete. And that will delete the video that's in there. And now we can create a new one just by Control Shift clicking. And you see it's recording frames. And we'll just let it play through to its last keyframe and a little bit of time afterwards. Now we can go to the movie menu and we can play our movie. We get our snarl, we get our relax, and then our second thought. Again, if we want to export that, we go to the movie menu and export from here. Now, you don't have to do your render with just the default viewport. I can do a BPR render here. So if I do a BPR render, go to my render menu, go to BPR shadow, and let's just turn up angle a little bit and then redo that render just to soften the edges of our shadows. There you go, gives us a little bit of a nicer render. Now if I Control Shift click, well, first off, let's delete the frames that we already have. Control Shift click, and it's going to render each frame before it writes it out. So I'm going to clip out this render because this is actually going to take a bit of time because it does BPR render each individual frame. But it's a really nice way to show the best look of your animation possible by giving it a nice render. So I'll be back when this render is complete. Now that render has completed, if we go to the movie palette here and click play movie, we can see the render with the nice shadows. So it's a really good way to present your work. So again, you can export that with the export button here. Just make sure that you have export highest quality turned on. And it does export as an MPG file. Now I mentioned that there was another way to get your blend shapes out of Zbrush. If you happen to be a Maya user, this is a really interesting thing that you can do. If you go to the Z plugin menu and open up Maya blend shapes, here you have the ability to either export selected, visible, or all. If you select all, it will do all of your layers, and then click Export Maya Blend Shapes. And what it does is it steps down to the lowest subdivision level and exports out each layer as a blend shape. Then it will open up Maya and it will set up the blend shape deformer for you. So if you do elect to do this, I would make sure that your lowest subdivision level is high enough that it's reasonable to use in Maya. I actually deleted my lowest subdivision level because it was actually quite low. So this would be reasonable to bring into Maya as maybe a LOD 50, maybe LOD 100. I might even elect to go with a slightly higher subdivision level, something like that, to work with in Maya. And if that were the case, I would just delete lower and then export from there. So again, that is under Z plugin, Maya Blend Shapes. So that is how we use layers in ZBrush to generate facial expressions and blend shapes, and actually how we can create animations directly inside of ZBrush using those layer tools. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I think layers are very, very powerful. They're very stable. Earlier iterations of them I didn't think were quite as stable as they are now. They can increase your file size, but I think that they're very, very powerful, especially in a pipeline where you may very well need to separate out certain bits of sculpture or painting. So you can easily mix and match, take one away, add another, especially in a conceptual phase. So I think it's a really, really powerful tool set to be aware of and understand how to use. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.